Hello, hello. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to see you all for the last session of FaceToFace 2022. This is the Art of Undoing Ableism. FaceToFace, Arts and Education Conference, is made possible by the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, as well as by funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. And this session itself is specifically brought to you by our very generous sponsor, Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts. So a very big thank you to them for making this possible today. My name is Kinsey Keck. I am a white cisgendered woman. I have brown chin-length hair and long bangs that come down to touch the top of my rose-colored wireframe round glasses that I'm wearing today. I'm also wearing a black t-shirt and some neon yellow Beats earbuds. And I'm sitting in an office with a bookshelf behind me and two white doors on either side of my background. And I'm also the programming and membership manager for the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable. Although we are currently meeting via Zoom online, the Roundtable would like to acknowledge that we do work and live on unceded lands. Mannahatta, or the place that is also widely known as New York City, exists on the contemporary and ancestral homelands of the Canarsie, Lenape, Munsee, and Wappinger people. These sovereign nations and communities are still thriving here, and we continue to occupy their lands. We would like to give a moment of respect to them, as well as to the Black and immigrant communities which have helped build the city that we know today. As we recognize that all of our past, presents, and futures are intertwined, we would like to lift up a number of contemporary Indigenous arts organizations that we can all support and learn from that are in the New York City area. I have their names and their websites linked in the chat. I encourage you to learn more about those organizations, specifically to support them with donations if possible. And I also invite you to share any resources or organizations that you would like to highlight in the chat. Thank you. Just a few more reminders before we get started. If you're having any trouble with Zoom, please do send me a private message. You can also message my colleague, Alex Latore. She's in the space with us and here to help. A reminder to please keep your mic setting on mute unless you are the person speaking. We do encourage you to use the chat to ask questions and connect with other people on the call. We will try to save some time at the end of our session today for a Q&A. So put all of your questions in the chat. We will be keeping them and we will try to get to them if we can. I also would like to acknowledge that we have closed captioning and ASL interpretation on this call. To activate your captions, click the live transcript button on your Zoom toolbar and select show subtitles. For our ASL interpreters, as you can see, we will be spotlighting them and the folks who are speaking. If you don't require access to that and would like to see everyone in the space, I invite you to click view, it should be in the top right corner of your screen, and select gallery view, and you'll be able to see everyone who's present there. I also want to note that this event is being recorded and will be made available on the Roundtable's website and YouTube channel. And that is it for me. It is my very distinct and sincere pleasure to invite our panelists for today's session to take the floor. We are welcoming Dustin Gibson. Dustin is the Director of Access, Disability, and Language Justice at People's Hub. We're also welcoming Yo-Yo Lynn. Yo-Yo is an artist. And we also have Shannon Finnegan, who is also an artist, joining our panel. And I'm adding a spotlight for Shannon. Here we are. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And I leave it to you to take it away.
Hey, cool. This is Dustin. I'm a light-skinned black man. I have a beard, got a white top on with a Pittsburgh hat. In the background, I think the only visible thing on the wall is a poster that says "Sanctuary comes out of uprising." This is a part of a collection that was created in part with community, led by a publishing company called Press, here in Baltimore, where I'm at right now. Um, as like we as we gather here today, I feel like I'm like starting like a wedding by saying that. But like as we gather, like thinking about like the art of undoing ableism, or I guess the practice of undoing ableism, um, feels like important to mention that it's not just like, you know, about the discrimination of disabled people. It is like about like a larger undoing of a system, and the way in which we're doing that, at least how I'm like thinking about it, is attempting to intervene and implement access as a way to get somewhere. So never thinking about accessibility or access as like the destination or the endpoint. On the screen now is like image of Shannon's work, and now I'm like nervous because I'm explaining it in front of Shannon. But it's a collection of blue benches. There's a brick wall in the background. There's a dog on the floor. There's also a door that's visible in the background. And the most prominent bench says, "I'd rather be sitting on the backside." In the bottom, it says, "Sit if you agree." And the way that I've like interpreted this, or like really thought about this, is thinking about the construction of like what is and who is public. So I think so much of ableism, there's a working and living definition that T.L. Lewis has led, thinking about the different components and influences of ableism, meaning like imperialism, colonialism, misogyny, and even that one of colonialism, thinking about like the privatization of anything, land being one of the big ones. Like before colonialism, there's like no necessarily like private or public sector, and like things are for the common good. So as we create that, as we create and operate in these structures of things being private or public, we're constructing who is and what is public or private. And ableism is doing so much of that work to exclude people or include people in those spaces. So I think about this art piece as like really an intervention or disruption as to, okay, a museum space where there's not seating, and there's like an expectation that you stand for long periods of time, or you walk for long periods of time, or that you can do either. And if you can't, then you're not a part of the public that is existing there. And that is just like one like small, you know, situation or scenario, I guess. But this invitation to sit, to me, feels like what it means to undo ableism. So I never think about it as like this silver bullet where we come up with these, you know, large, complex accessibility plans, and now everything is 100% accessible. But I think about the art of undoing ableism is doing what Shannon did with these benches thousands of times, hundreds of thousands of times. And in the practice of that, we are learning how to be together, how to deliberate, how to debate, which is core and central to participating in any type of self-governance structure. And at the root of that is self-determination. So not wanting to lose like what we're here for, and wanting to have self-determined lives, not in like an American individualistic way, but a way that like actually provides us agency and autonomy over where we want to go and how we want to be. And now I'm gonna ask Shannon if you want to hop on and maybe explain like some of the benches, and then also like, I guess, what do you think about that, like thinking around your art?
This is Shannon speaking. I'm a white person with short hair, and I'm in my early 30s. Sometimes people say I look a little younger than that. And I'm in my apartment in front of a colorful bookshelf. I'm wearing a soft, oversized sweatshirt today, so I'm feeling cozy. And I use they them pronouns. Yeah, I mean, thank you, Dustin, for that yeah, kind of read on the work. I think that all feels really resonant to me. I think, yeah, in the most kind of simple version of the story of this work, I have a physical disability where standing and walking for a long time really increased my pain levels. So I'm always kind of like looking for where I can sit down as I move through different spaces, and had the idea for this work after like a particularly painful visit to a museum where I was like, there's so much space here, there are so many resources, and the seating is so sparse. And as I started to do research about how those decisions were being made, what I was hearing is that a lot of times it's a curatorial choice. So the kind of person selecting all the artworks in the show is also in charge of deciding where there will and won't be seating. And there are all of these kind of ableist assumptions, as Dustin kind of said, about who is going to be in that space and what they might need. And so I realized that a kind of like workaround was to make artworks that were also functional as places to sit. So anytime these are shown, visitors can sit on them, they can be used, they can lounge, they can hang out. And I think, Dustin, what you said about like this being one of what needs to be like millions of things feels so true, because I think, yeah, this is such a specific and kind of small example. And I hope one thing that I've been thinking about related to the work also is that it has this handwritten text on it. That's so the kind of "I'd rather be sitting, sit if you agree" is, I think it's clear that it's not from the voice of the museum, that it's this kind of outside or like oppositional voice. And I hope that like by bringing that into the space, that also opens up possibilities for other people to think about ways that they are upset about the way the space is being structured and made. And yeah, and I'll also just say, like, the text really varies. Like, some of the text is really specific. Like, there's one that says, "I'd like more time with this artwork, but all the standing is painful. Sit if you agree." And then there's ones that are more general like this. That's just, "I'd rather be sitting. Sit if you agree." And I think that's felt important to me in the work in terms of just like the ways that some people who like identifying as disabled is a really complicated thing, and wanting this kind of like looseness around this, where it's like someone who might not identify as disabled or may not feel like they have that embodied experience at all might still appreciate an opportunity to rest, and that kind of like opens up possibilities for solidarity and connection.
This is Dustin. Thank you. And I think with that, like, we should probably welcome people to be as they need to in this space too. So if you would rather be sitting, I encourage you to sit if you agree, or lay down or move around. Anything that's shown on the screen, we'll do our best to describe it, so that could maybe allow you to move freely through your space as you need to. And don't forget that you have bodies. Actually encourage people to not look at the screen too. That might be like some of the things that, you know, create tiredness and exhaustion. Some of the other practices that want to engage in, just to, yeah, I guess be accountable to each other here, are saying our name before we speak. There's a bunch of benefit to that, particularly with interpretation and captioning. It allows people to actually know what's going on or who is speaking, and allows us to move around. Letting somebody know if something comes up. And I don't say that lightly, like it is a hard thing to disclose. At times disability, other times just like what our needs are. We recognize that it's tied to something larger. So if you do let any of us know, and there's issues, like we can pause for that. Like so much of white supremacy is like, we got to get through the agenda of the script. And we can pause, and we understand that to be a part of the work, not an addition or a burden. We pay attention to the chat as much as we can. Hopefully you can use the chat like throughout this conversation to put questions in there that are coming up for you, or thoughts. And at the end, we'll have time to yeah, respond to things, maybe conversationally. And then the last one is interdependence, which is kind of tying all of these things together. It is not us as like people that are, I guess, engaged in this conversation on a platform to grant, or we don't have the authority to grant access for people. So much of how society is constructed is an authority figure or a power structure that grants somebody the access where we must request it from them. And here, how we want to be is like in a collective way, understanding that we all have to be doing that with each other for it to actually be accessible. And the practice that I skipped was describing images, because again, I am now nervous to describe an image of Yo-Yo with Yo-Yo here. So maybe if you can let us know what's going on in this and describe it for us.
Yeah, totally. This is Yo-Yo speaking. To just give like a visual description of myself in my room right now, I'm in my home office. There's a keyboard behind me. I'm wearing a flannel. My hair is like half up. I'm, yeah, definitely kind of like moving into the morning vibes at the moment. So yeah, very relaxed looking right now. I'm East Asian, I'm Taiwanese American. I'm in my late 20s and I use she and they pronouns. Yeah, so this image that you selected is actually an image of me in the rehearsal space. I'm dancing. I have on a gray kind of strapless bra and like black leggings. So most of my upper body is exposed, and attached to my upper shoulder are these round discs, which are contact microphones. And these microphones are attached to a wire that's hanging from the ceiling, which is then attached to a musician. So in this particular rehearsal, I'm practicing listening to my body. So these microphones are picking up the different sounds of my moving joints and tissues and muscles. So they're like these creaking and crackling sounds that are being emitted. And when the microphone picks these up, my friend essentially samples them with their synthesizer and transforms them into music, which I then dance to. So yeah, like in this practice, it's really, yeah, great that you chose this image, I think, because it is so much of an ongoing practice for me, like this practice of, yeah, like granting myself the space and access to my own bodily needs and my own also bodily expression. And yeah, a lot of what this piece has grown into has been this process of like practicing listening to my body, practicing listening to my collaborator, Despina, the musician. And it is very much a piece that is centered around that interdependency of thinking through like, you know, I can't, you know, create this piece with their, the way that like this piece is like created is completely interdependent on each other, where my friend is creating the music, which I then dance to, and I also create more sounds, which then create more music. So there's this feedback loop that happens where it just keeps layering and layering and growing and growing. And it's different every time we do it. So depending on the sounds that my body was producing that day, the music will also be different. So yeah, it's a very like reciprocal piece. And oftentimes I'm like moving and dancing alone, and I still think about the ways in which these sounds in my body exist, but it's only through being in relationship with my collaborator does the sound actually become music. So yeah, that's a little bit about the piece.
This is Dustin. I think that's like a beautiful explanation too of maybe how, access is performed, is like thinking about it as like components that are building on top of each other. And like a musical composition is what feels like a salient example of that. On the screen now, there's artwork from Park MacArthur. It is a collection of ramps. They're using different material, plywood, steel, 2x4s, aluminum. They're compiled on the floor of a gallery space. And the last baseline value that's on the screen is access is a practice, a culture, and a value. And as Yo-Yo is talking, like I'm thinking about like one, that practice is something that is like repetitive and like we have to do over and over, and we're building muscles and we're building knowledge and history in doing that. And then that has the ability to transform a culture. And then it being rooted in a value, which feels important, because we're like thinking about access is not something where we're just like, again, like this destination point, or we're trying to reach 100% accessible world, but it is like we're using access to do something else, whether that is to create connection, whether that is to build a new economy, whether that is to have a different political system or government structure. But access is the tool to that. The one at the top is the law is not a moral compass. So the Americans with Disability Act might be the most comprehensive piece of civil rights legislation that we have. And it still does not provide us like access or engagement at times. So thinking just because there is a ramp into a building, that doesn't mean that it's accessible, right? Below that is proximity to disability doesn't equate to having them. Just like really understanding that agency and autonomy has been stripped from disabled folks for so long is one of the reasons like I'm excited to be in this conversation with artists that are projecting into the world like maybe like a different understanding of disability for people to connect to and for folks to learn from. We create safety, meaning that's us, that's not institutions, it's not prisons, police. And everyone deserves the dignity of risk, which is also connected to that second piece about autonomy. So I'm gonna stop screen share now, and maybe if we can, Shannon, I'm not sure if you want to go first, like just maybe talk about like some of your work broadly, like what you're doing now, what's on your heart. And I guess intro yourself.
This is Shannon. This is sometimes tricky for me to just do continuously. So if you have if Dustin or Yo-Yo, if you have anything that you're like, oh, mention this or something like that, feel free to jump in. But yeah, I am an artist, and I have made, I think a lot of times, Dustin, you were kind of mentioning this, like access in service of what? I think, and I'm thinking about Mia Mingus's writing also around liberatory access. And that's something that I've been thinking about in my work, is that a lot of it is focused around this idea of creating access in service of connection, specifically like connection between disabled people or across disabilities, and doing that in ways that are not the kind of like compliance oriented approach that I so often experience in the world, that has this very minimum effort kind of checkbox mentality to it, but instead thinking about how we, again, kind of as you were saying, as how we're all part of a kind of access ecosystem, and that's something that we're doing together and creating together, and that is an inherently creative and generative practice that creates new, or maybe not new, but creates varied possibilities for how we might be together in the world. So an example of my practice is I've had this ongoing project called Anti-Stairs Club Lounge that is basically a kind of way of gathering people who share an aversion to stairs. And the project has taken form in a few different places, but it's always kind of in opposition to an inaccessible space. So it becomes this space for people who can't or don't want to engage in a stair-heavy art experience to be together and to hang out and kind of have our own experience in space. I saw it in the chat, someone said stairs like steps, or stairs like people looking at someone. Stairs like steps, but it is a nice, I think, I forget what that's called, homonym. Yeah, and another project that I've been doing is the seating project, which I talked a little bit about. And then another recent project is a collaboration with another disabled artist, Bojana Kokliat, that's all about image description practices online, called Alt Text as Poetry. That is really a space for people to get together and talk about how we might practice sensory translation, so translating something visual into text, though also thinking about translating sound into text or tactile feelings into text. And that has been a kind of like workshop, and also we have a workbook and a series of materials that are available online. That again, I think it kind of going back to what you were saying, Dustin, it's not about us coming in and being like, this is how you do this, but much more being like, whoa, yeah, how do we do this? Like, what, these are some questions that are on our mind, like, how are you engaging with this, or what comes up for different people as they're doing that practice?
This is Dustin, and just making note that like some of the references that are made are also in the chat as well. And I would encourage all of us to, yeah, put things in the chat as they come up. Yo-Yo, do you want to do the same? Maybe just talk about your work, intro who you are, tell us anything that you want about yourself.
Yeah, totally. Man, intros are very hard, but I will give it a shot. Yeah, thank you, Shannon, for sharing that. Yeah, I think I am an interdisciplinary artist, so I work with many different kinds of mediums. I'm particularly working with video, animation, and live performance. And yeah, a lot of my performance practice came out of me exploring my chronic illness experience. So it essentially like grew out of like this interest in like re-establishing a connection to the body. And I think, you know, that fascination came from like desiring that, because not having that as someone who grew up disabled and experiences lots of chronic pain, I think oftentimes the body is like a very contentious space for me. So I think having access to, you know, conceptions and language and ideas about my body that isn't coming from an ableist or white or institutional perspective was very important to me. So I began exploring this through movement-based work. Some of like, a lot of it actually is growing from that piece that we just shared where I'm connecting these microphones to my body. And yeah, like kind of like working with the material of the body as a way of, yeah, understanding it a bit more, but also kind of like situating it itself in a space that is centered around like care, centering around like the ways in which we move through the world, like how do we honor the wholeness of our bodies, and also how do we honor what we need and like what we need to access movement expression, or what we need to like what kinds of relationships do we build in creating art as well. So I think, yeah, a lot of the movement and performance practice is centered around that, of like creating relationships, creating ways of being that, yeah, stem from a desire to be together, a desire to witness each other and each other's wholeness, and also creating spaces that feel, yeah, like a space for healing. I think a lot of my work has been gearing more towards that space. One of the works that Dustin and I, that you're familiar with is the Resilience Journal project. That is a journal that I created. It's essentially a daily tracking framework where people can kind of like log the different embodied experiences they have day to day. And a lot of that is coming from my own personal practice of like wanting to develop a relationship and a language for the body that is coming from my own terms. So yeah, thinking about the body not as just something that is like quantifiable in like the medical sense, but also something that is qualitative and, contains a lot of like soft, fuzzy data as well. And yeah, like through that exploration, there came a lot of like, yeah, like different experiences from different people. Like people also wanted to engage with the work. And so I created this journal so that people could download it and also fill it out themselves. And it's part of this like ongoing work of like archiving these experiences that are often invisibilized, overlooked, or like hidden just based off of like necessity or survival. So yeah, like I think a lot about like people in my communities, like people who are immigrants, people who like don't have conceptions of like the Western disability model, and like how do they conceptualize illness and how do they conceptualize disability, and what are the ways in which we can like grow a collective, or even, yeah, like a collective or kind of like specific to our communities kind of language to how we talk about illness and disability and trauma. So yeah. So that's kind of like a broad stroke of the work that I'm doing. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. So this is Dustin. I think context for this conversation could be important. I'm coming into this not as an artist, but as an organizer that is interested in the freedom of all people, specifically disabled folks, and particularly like folks that are incarcerated, whether that be medical incarceration through asylum, state hospitals, or other forms of incarceration like prisons, jails. And like one of the projects that I've been working on at People's Hub is it's a popular education movement school. We have a new program that is artists in residence, just I guess basically a way to like pay artists to just continue living and doing what they need to do, which feels important. Understanding that art is like something that is like vital to life, really, and not even just progression. But one of the artists who I'm going to screen share some of her work here is Elena House Hay. Elena and I have been friends for some time. She is incarcerated in a prison in Pennsylvania. On the left side of the screen is like one of her older self-portraits when she had longer hair. She's wearing like a maroon jumpsuit, which is the Department of Corrections uniform. Behind her, there's like a purple squid that's going up into the room or the wall that's behind her. She's seated at a desk. The desk is very large in comparison to her body, and she's writing something. Elena is a writer as well as a visual artist. I think she just finished her first like mural or banner project too. And then on the right side is one of the pieces that Elena sent this week, based off of like some conversations around disability. So I approach like this type of work as somebody that is like, okay, well, we're attempting to organize to, get people out of prisons because we understand like the construction of a prison or even the existence of it is one that perpetuates ableism. It's one that is like deeply rooted in, colonialism, imperialism. It's this political tool. And the existence of it is like actually blocking us from like the type of care that we want to have in community that would benefit all of us, right? And it's also, this driver of disability or exacerbator of it. Many of the prisons are built on coal waste dumping sites, or the land is toxic, or they're creating toxic land and water, and is affecting like so many more people than just like the folks that are in prison. But this piece from Elena, and I'll do my best to describe it, it has like a squiggly line at the top left, and that squiggle kind of like moves throughout this entire piece. The first set of shapes is a triangle, and then it's squared, circles, and then triangles, and then squares. And then I think that might be a hexagon. I don't know, whatever has 5 sides. And then the last one is another piece. And the only place where the squiggly line fits is the coffin at the end. So it's a very morbid piece, I guess. But it's talking like she titled this ill fit or I'll fit. And just like thinking about like herself as an artist and like, where does she fit in this? Like, she's also in prison as well. So her access to resources are very constricted. Like even this piece here, she can only have 2 of them completed at a time in her cell. And she can only have 4 blank canvases at a time. And then her access to like material, like she can't have acrylics that she mixes the paint and then puts a cap on it. Like, so every time she goes to paint, she must remember or at least document how she mixed the paint. So I'm thinking about her as a disabled artist, like creating these things about like fitting into a larger socio-political context, and then how that like, provides like, I guess, vulnerability to premature death. Because the amount of barriers is like reducing like opportunities at life to a certain extent. And that restriction that is placed on her, it is so much of like what inaccessibility does, whether you're incarcerated or not. So I guess I'm going to stop sharing now. So this was like kind of like the impetus to like having this conversation in the open, which I feel fortunate to do, thinking about like, okay, Elena like creates this. There's also like this other like generation of movement around like people in her same prison attempting to get free. And then the organizing that happens on the outside and inside as well. And how does this like art, like, I guess, like benefit that? Like, where is it situated in that larger context, right? Like, as disabled artists, I think you all are facing barriers that other artists might not face. There's restrictions, some that your own body creates, own mind creates, and others that are environmental and conditional. But that I feel like makes like a very unique like art making process. So with that, like, do you think about like how you're a part of a larger movement? Like, what is your duty, I guess, as an artist? Do you have a duty to a larger movement for, I guess, like anti-ableism pushes? I'm gonna stop there, and if that doesn't make sense, let's talk through for clarity, I guess.
Yo-Yo, do you want to jump in, or do you want?
Yeah, I mean, I love to like talk this through with y'all too, because I definitely feel like we have been operating from a space of like service in some ways. And I think there is this accountability that we've been developing with each other in terms of like how we continue to create and imagine more access into the world, and working, yeah, like working on these access points with specific people, specific communities. So yeah, like I guess that's always something that I've always wanted to ask you too, Shannon, where it's just like, yeah, like what, like where do you see the scope of your, yeah, like responsibility or, yeah, like desire for creating this work and like how that ties into, yeah, like the broader movement as a whole. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, maybe it's helpful to talk a little bit about kind of how I got to this place a little bit, which is that like I've been disabled since I was a kid. I grew up disabled, but I was really isolated from other disabled people, even though I grew up in Berkeley, California, which is a tremendous hub of disability organizing. But I think this happens all the time with ableism, where it pushes disabled people to really think of their experiences as personal, as individualized, as private to a certain extent, or kind of shameful. And it wasn't until I was in college that there was another disabled student there. And then also I started to learn a little bit about the world of disability studies. And it was this transformational experience for me, because all of these things that I thought were just like my own unique experiences, I understood were shared and culturally shaped and socially shaped. And that was, I just understood myself in the world, myself and the world, myself in the world, in such a different way. And that kind of, and have continued to have that feeling through the work of other disabled artists, writers, thinkers, organizers. And so I think my work comes a lot from a desire to be part of that ecosystem of kind of like the experiencing the freedoms, I guess, or kind of liberation that has come for me in terms of I don't know, I think about it sometimes as a kind of mirroring or like refracting or and so wanting to participate in that. And then because so many of the spaces for experiencing and exhibiting artwork are inaccessible, I've felt like I want to try to work against that or intervene. But for me, it really comes from a desire of like who I want to connect with and who I want to experience the work. And and so like how can I both like, I think sometimes use the artwork itself to intervene, or also there's all this stuff that I'm sure you both are doing all the time that happens behind the scenes, where you're just like emailing being like, you know, what's the situation with this access thing, like have you thought about this, or like, you know, and so, but yeah, I think also going back to this idea of access as a practice, that it's like there's just so much that I don't know. And you know, I have a very specific positionality as a white physically disabled person that like means that there's lots that I haven't considered or need to like kind of sit more deeply with. And so kind of, returning to that idea of a practice or kind of iteration or shifting or taking in new things and kind of not new information, but doing research or through conversation or things like that. Thinking through ways to shift what I'm doing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like I feel like there is so much within the context of like how we make art that is part of the access making. And with your work specifically, like it's so like layered and in unison. Like I feel like it's like this like really beautiful musical chord every time you strike it, because you're like hitting all these notes. And yeah, like I think a lot of what you were talking about like resonated with me too, where it's just like there is this amount of like, like the ableism is everywhere. Like it's part of the air that we breathe. It's like in the water. I think growing up, I was also very isolated, and you know, that kind of like was a big part of my experience of like not only was I isolated, I was also like actively hiding that part of myself. And it's like, it's like kind of a cultural thing. Like I feel like, especially in like Taiwanese culture that I know of, like disability is not something we talk about. Disability is not something we like identify as, you know, it's not something that is a cultural thing. I think that's, you know, slowly shifting with like the internet. There's like more ability to connect, to find other people that have similar experiences, to like build language together. And I think, like from that isolation, there was like a sense of like, like, you know, I'm the only person with this experience, or like, this is like my unique experience. But coming into making this artwork that I described, like so much of that has been a vehicle of like opening, like, like opening my practice into a space and opening myself into a space with disability community. And, you know, I've only been making this work since like 2019. So a lot of this work is still very much emerging, and I'm still kind of figuring out like where I am situated within disability community, within disability arts community, and also within the arts community. So like I've been really thinking through like the ways in which how I work has completely changed. I'm really always working, you know, like working with like the artistic practices that I had and am continuing to develop. But now there's like so many more considerations that I also put into practice of like, oh, like who's going to experience the work, and like how is this work going to actually be like accessible, pleasurable, inviting for folks. And it's like the more people I meet as well, like within disability community, the more I see like, oh yeah, like these are the people that are gonna like also be the people that I engage with my art. So therefore, like this art needs to be possibly like accessible for them. So I think the practice is changing as I build these relationships. And like, as I have these conversations and like, as I like build these friendships, you know, like, I'm like, oh, like this is my community. Like this is the people that I want to make work with and for. So it's been shifting in that way. Yeah.
This is Dustin. There was like one of my mentors who is now an ancestor, Milton Henderson. Milt used the chair, and he used to like. I remember the first time I heard him say like, they made us fight to get onto the sidewalk. Now we have to fight to get down it. And he was referencing like some of the tables that, I mean, still exist in downtown Pittsburgh, on the sidewalk, and, you know, not enough space to navigate it with the chair, let alone like have two people walk together. But I remember since the first time I heard that, like I never looked at like a table on the sidewalk in the same way. Or the first time I learned about like a ramp into a building, I never looked at like that one step that many towns have in their business districts the same way again. So it was like, once I knew, I can't not know anymore. So I think about like as an organizer too, and I'm sure that y'all encounter this as an artist, that there is an incredible amount of labor, an incredible amount of responsibility that I feel when being a part of anything. Because it's like, if I know that this thing is like a exclusionary practice or a barrier to either myself or my people, like it is, like it's hard for me to not do anything about that. And that's an exhausting process for me. So I guess my question is, Carolyn Lazard has this piece called Recipe for Disaster. And in it, Carolyn is like, not an accommodation that we get to be grateful to join your party. Like, well, your party sucks and I don't like omelets much. And that'll seem like wildly out of context until you like look at that piece. But I think about like, what is like, I don't know, like, does that have an impact? Like that type of labor, like that happens in the background, where we're working with institutions at times that like their whole existence is one of like colonialism. So it's like, does it actually matter if they're more accessible? And out of fear, I'm going to ask one more question too. Like the work that y'all are talking about, at least I'm hearing, is like deeply personal. Like the resilience journal that Yo-Yo is talking about, that's like literally Yo-Yo's like data. Like that is your life that is in that. And like, I guess, what is your hope of the impact of that, both on like the institutions or the structures that you're engaging with to like make more accessible for whatever reason? And then, because that's like a very personal thing that you have to share, like Mia talks about, to get your basic needs met, like what is your hope? Like when you broadcast that into the world, is it just connection, or is it like something more?
In terms of the first part of that question, which is like, I think part of how I heard it was like, what does it even mean to engage with institutions that are so harmful? Like, is it possible to, what's possible within that structure? And that's something that I'm asking myself a lot, is and I think it's easy to get in, like the museum, for example, like it really wants to, I feel this like way that structure is trying to draw me in to putting all of my energy and resources into trying to transform it. Like it has this kind of like, it soaks up that energy. And so I think one thing that's been important for me is to try to be working in a variety of ways or arenas simultaneously. And you know, I've done projects that are like, are commissioned by museums or things like that, that are very directly supported by them. And I've also done projects that are, that are like outside of that, that are kind of self-organized or some combination of that. And I think that has been helpful for me. I read this interview that Carolyn Lazard did, I think it was in Bomb magazine, where they were talking about, like, I'm going to not paraphrase this super well, but like, basically like, if we can't change the museum or the other institution, like, can we at least like kind of drain resources from it? And put those into other things. And so I've been thinking about that a little bit. Yeah, I don't know. Yo-Yo, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, no, I remember that bomb interview and I was just like, yes, Carolyn, I think, yeah, we've been thinking a lot about, because I also do a lot of like space organizing. Like I started this movement practice collective called Rotations, and we meet to like share our movement practices with each other. And each time we like invite a different disabled movement artist to share their practice to a group of disabled adjacent like practitioners. So I think, yeah, like in that space, you know, we weren't trying to like create our own nonprofit. Like we weren't trying to like create like a system that would like be able to like receive granting and stuff like that, because we really wanted to like just remain an independent practice and then like have different kinds of relationships like partnerships or fellowships with different spaces like institutions like BACS, the Brooklyn Arts Exchange, and like being that arm for us to get the funding and receive the funding in order for us to be able to, you know, offer these classes for free and offer these kinds of different practice shares in a way that is financially accessible to everyone. So I think, yeah, we're also kind of like trying to figure out how to orient ourselves to institutions in a way that still like maintains our own autonomy and integrity, and also be able to like create these relationships that will allow us to like get the funding that we need. So yeah, I think that's very difficult within the system, especially when so much of this is reliant on these kinds of like funding practices. But yeah, like I think that's what a lot of these conversations with institutions have been about, though, where it's just like, how do we like, at least with the organizations and institutions I've been talking to, just like, how do we like, yeah, like de-institutionalize a bit, you know, like how do we like break down how these funding structures are structured, how we like ask our artists to, you know, not only do their art, but also like create ways for our organization to become more accessible. Like I've seen this like with spaces that want to become like more like #diverse, you know? So it's like they bring in like different people of color, and then like suddenly it's like they realize that the space itself is not accessible and not built for that. So then the artists end up doing like a lot of labor and making that happen. So I think, yeah, like when it comes down to that, it really is a very tenuous space. And I don't actually know. Oh, I'm going to pause for the ASL to catch up. Yeah, it's just like, I don't actually know how to move with institutions. I think I've been doing it very like sporadically and with a distance. And I think so much of that is something that we're still trying to figure out, and we're still trying to like work as artists, like do the work that we want to do, but also knowing that because of like the intersections we hold as disabled artists, to like be able to create spaces within these institutions, galleries, spaces that like have practiced exclusionary practices for a very long time. Like, how do we work to also dismantle that through working with them and through being invited into these spaces, or just like finding key people who work there as well to like hopefully have more long-term meaningful relationships that we build in making like the space actually feel safe and feel actually like welcoming for people. But yeah, that takes a lot of work. And, you know, Shannon and I have been in many different conversations where some of those have failed, you know, some of those have been like very like difficult conversations that kind of didn't lead to places. And sometimes there are these really blossoming, growing relationships when like there is someone who's like very deeply invested in like creating access and creating like ways of like inclusive practice into the space that has become like quite transformative for not only us as artists, but also like these kinds of spaces and these kinds of organizations. But I guess moving into the second part of your question, Dustin, I'm trying to remember what it is, but I remember it was a great question.
This is Dustin. Just asking like about the personal nature. Like so much of your work is about like your body and how you move through the world. And yeah, it feels like you're projecting that. And like, I guess like, what is your hope, the impact that will have on you or, you know, people that engage with it?
Yeah, totally.
And this is Dustin. Maybe I'll give you some more context too, because I'm thinking about this as like, there's an artist, Salim Hugh Penny, who is the other artist in residence at People's Hub. And Salim is not like making poetry to speak to disability, but because he's disabled, like it manifests in a way in which like when you're engaging with it, you have to confront the fact that it is a disabled poet. And I think that's something that is unique to a disabled artist that other artists might, I mean, I'm speaking in generalizations here, but they might not contend with in the same way, where disability is a part of it. It's a part of how you show up. It's a part of like how you do meetings prior to, you know, whatever exhibition, or it's a part of how you make the art and the pauses that you might have to. So like all of that to me feels like deeply personal, and like you're sharing it with the world. And I'm just like, is there like a desired outcome, or is it just like, it's just who you are, I guess, and you don't think about the impact? Because, and I say that with the Resilience Journal, when I first read it, it landed with me and I was like, oh, this is about chronic illness. And it was the first time like I viewed my disabilities in the context of a chronic illness. And it was like a revelatory moment for me to think about like a long-term thing. It also helped me see like a future or myself in the future in a way I hadn't before. And I think that's just like really powerful, I guess. So wondering if you think about that on like the front end.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think this is Yo-Yo speaking. I think for me, it always comes from a very personal space. I think with the art that I make is always coming from like these like very like intimate relationships and intimate experiences that I have. And I don't know how to make any other kind of work, to be honest. I think there is a lot there when I like am making the work where I'm like, you know, if it's personal, it will resonate with someone. Because I know, like so much of, I think what like we end up like kind of like how ableism has like seeped into our lives, where it's just like we like put ourselves in these like individualistic identities and boxes of like, oh, like only I'm experiencing this and this is like my unique experience. But our experiences are so tied into everyone else's. So I'm just like, when I'm making the work, it's always like, okay, I'm making this work ultimately, yes, like it is for me, but if I like share it out and I'm receiving different kinds of experiences back, I start like using and like generating these kinds of experiences like back into the work that I make. So it's always this kind of like conversation kind of starter, I think, where it's not just like me like kind of like doing my own thing and like staring at myself, but it's more just like, here's like this part of me that I really want to share with you, and like I want to like know how you're going to receive it and what you receive. And yeah, like the resilience journal has evolved a lot. I started teaching for the first time. So I started teaching through this fellowship at NYU, and we developed, I say we, but I worked on this syllabus called Media Making as a Healing Practice. And so I had like my 15 students kind of, spend like 3-4 weeks developing their own kind of journaling practice and their own kind of resilience framework. And it could be like asking the question of like, how does healing emerge in their daily lives? How does care emerge in their daily lives? And it was really interesting seeing how the students like, practice with the resilience journal framework for 1 week, and then like the next assignment was them creating their own framework. And it was really interesting to see how the students were then able to, like use my framework as like a stepping stone to creating their own way of, like paying attention to things that they care about in the world. And so, like part of me was just like, oh, like seeing this in real time of like, this framework I made for myself then became like a stepping stone for someone to create their own way of implementing care into their lives.
You got a job already. Do you know who I brought? Who made me a little late?
Yeah, so there's just been lots of ways in which people have kind of like used this as like a way to create a way of holding space for like difficult or painful experiences, to create a way for them to pay attention to something that they've been kind of like holding inside and not sharing. It also has become like a framework for people to like advocate for themselves and others. So like I think I'm currently seeing how the work kind of ripples outwards and kind of transforms, and is like synthesized into something for each, for other people, like for those that receive this work.
This is Shannon. So much of what you said, Yo-Yo, I think I feel very similarly, both in terms of being like, I often work in ways that like feel possible to me, or like kind of moving from what I know, or kind of following a instinct or something like that. And that this is kind of, kind of returning to that as a guidepost when I can. But then, also this idea of the way the work is going to be understood or used or influence other people feels often very unknown to me in the process. But I feel, going back to this idea of interdependence, like I feel that, like both that my work would not be possible without the work of so many other people that have influenced me, and I've felt the ripples from their work, and then also that I like the work kind of, I'm putting it out there, and then I'm also hearing back from people sometimes about it, or noticing different things, and that also influences the way that I continue to work and shift things. But I think the question of impact can sometimes be a hard one for me, because it's like there's so much that needs to change, and it's really hard to know what strategies or ways of working and moving might be impactful. And I try to think about myself, and not to individualize it too much, and kind of think of myself as one part of something much larger, where because of course there's like so many ways that people learn or understand or and so that like a bench might be one way of kind of thinking through something, and an essay or a poem or a painting, you know, all of those are can be really powerful tools. And but yeah, I think definitely going back to that feeling of like wanting to be one of many.
Yeah. This is Dustin. I guess I just have like one more question. I think this is like something that we talked about before, is like, it feels like when I engage with it, I mean, this is not just isolated to artists, but it's also like, you know, different types of organizers, or like what type of organizing work, like people that might do like administrative type of work or jail support or something. There's like an evaluation that happens where like activists or organizers are, you know, put on a pedestal, and then like we have like a hierarchy there. So when it comes like around questions about like a movement for disability justice, it's like artists, like the response to me is like sometimes like, well, like I kind of take cues from like organizers or something. And I've been like thinking about like, yo, do we have a movement for disability justice? My conclusion has been no. And I say that, you know, given like everything that has happened during a pandemic, and disabled people being the folks targeted, like overwhelmingly targeted, and the most vulnerable disabled folks that are, you know, in total institutions, whether they're prisons, nursing facilities, them being the majority of people that have died. It's 2 out of 10 people in nursing facilities have died from COVID. That's like an astronomical number, right? And I think that has a lot to do with like our lack of response collectively, or the intentional response to COVID, is because they're like this disabled folks. And I think a movement is something that like counters that in a real way. And there hasn't been that. So that's like a part of like what's informing that. But I also think about a movement is like, you know, needing this ecosystem of people that do that administration, that jail support type of work, or, and this is just one thing I'm referencing because I'm thinking about it. The activism part of it, the mobilization part of it, the other organizing aspects, and the artistry, like all of those things, like I don't value one over the other. There's a different level of risk that people assume with certain types of activities, but it feels like we're in like this space where it's like disabled artistry is like becoming this thing. I don't know if that is like a production of foundations or a new focus from institutions, like, but it feels like it is like a generative space where there's more disabled artists that at least I'm being exposed to. And I worry about like that separation from movement, and just wondering like if y'all feel like there is like this disabled artistry like movement happening, and if it's connected to like, I guess, something that is like seeking justice. Yeah, and I asked that. I don't have like an answer to that, nor do I even have like an opinion formulated, I think. But it's just like a question that continuously comes up for me.
Yeah, this is Yo-Yo speaking. I resonate with that a lot. I have been having these thoughts too. I think a lot of the organizing work that I've been perceiving is, yeah, like it's more situated within and with disability arts. I think disability justice as like a place, like as a practice, I think is still, at least in my experiences, like I think it's something that we're like, in my, you know, experience, it's been something that has been like discussed a lot. Like we like talk about it. I was a part of this residency where we were doing like a reading group on like disability justice by Sins Invalid, the Skin, Tooth, and Bone kind of primer. And I've also been, like having like different discussions about disability justice. But I think it's always been like, okay, how do we orient ourselves and like learn about this series of like movement works, like the history behind it, the people who have like created this movement that has been happening, but how do we like orient ourselves within the context of this movement with the work that we do? And I think there definitely is like a gap there. I think there's definitely a way in which we're like referencing these kinds of principles and referencing these kinds of ways of practice, and like trying to figure out ways to implement these practices into our own ways of like space making, ways of like creating gathering spaces, performance spaces. There's also been multiple dance organizations that have been using this disability justice primer as like a way of like opening up conversation. So I see like the ripples of it. I see it, like I see people bringing them up into meetings. I see like non-disabled people talking about it, so I think there is this like there is like a undertone of like something's brewing, and I feel like there is this amount of like then kind of like us as the artists who are more like open about like our disability identity, working with disability community. I think it does put us into a place of like, okay, then we have to also implement these principles in the best that we can, and also be able to like work with access within our own practices and within the ways that we engage with our audiences. And so like it's not something that is like specific to like jail support or like creating like a specific like emergency aid network. But I have seen it emerge in these ways of like, how do we make work? How do institutions be less ableist and more inclusive? How do we, work in ways that are like sustainable for ourselves as artists, and also as people who, are artists and like advocates, activists, but also just like knowing where these practices reside. And I think the practices that I've been witnessing has been, like mostly within the arts, like zone, the art sphere. And I think, if Shannon, you want to like jump in on this, I think a lot of it is something that I'm like, okay, how do we bridge that gap? Like, how do we not just say disability justice, but also like actually like, practice it, but also like question it, and also just like be like, how does this actually fit into like what we're working with right now? And I think it often isn't implemented in a way that, like comes from an informed place, I guess. But that's what I'm like experiencing. Yeah.
This is Shannon. I like, just kind of so much of what you said, Yo-Yo, feels really resonant to me too. And I think one thing that it was making me think about, which actually kind of maybe goes back to your earlier question, Dustin, is that like, I feel like so many arts organizations that I engage with are so far from the things that would actually need to happen to create disability liberation. I'm thinking like things like abolition, land back, like these like end of capitalism, like these really big changes. And I think for me, that's like, I sometimes feel this slip in those arts-centered spaces where it's like the changes are so incremental and small. And I'm also kind of being told in those spaces that those are big wins. And so trying to like really like hold what the actual goals are, and not be kind of like sucked into this this kind of alternate like set of values or I don't know, that's maybe not the right way to say it, or the best way to say it, but I think and I think for me that's also some of where that disconnect comes from, is like that pull from the art world to like I feel the art world asking me to center my life and my work in that world, and trying to like understand when and how that world is useful and can create transformation and can be in service of disability liberation, and also really like when it can't, and make sure that I'm not putting all of my time and energy and resources into that space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Dustin. You mentioned something earlier, Shannon, about like draining the resources. There's like so much of this conversation where I'm like, it feels like we could be talking about a prison right now. And like how I guess we refer to it is like starving the beast. And like just the incredible amount of resources that exist like in prisons and institutions, and like the amount of investment that's there. Like there's not for the prisons per se, but there's like a level of excitement at being able to have like, what feels like disposable resources to implement access. And I think that also that's like maybe that's one of the issues too. Like one of the problems is so many of our needs have been commodified, where it's like we have to literally pay to get our needs met, whether that's healthcare, just basic things we have to pay for. So the institutions that hold that capital and those resources, we're almost like always at their whim. So a lot of like, I guess, a portion of what we've been doing at People Sub is thinking about like access under capitalism is if it is commodified, it'll never be sustainable. So what are the other ways that we could actually practice? That doesn't require that. If it requires us to like actually operate within a different type of economy, which most of the times it will, like, then we have to build those, right? Or we have to take from, what many indigenous people have done globally, really, and figure out how we can apply it to what we're all doing. So I know we only got like a couple of minutes left. I don't know if there was any questions that came in the chat. If there wasn't, maybe folks can drop them in now. Or if I guess like Shannon and Yo-Yo, if y'all had questions or things that you want to mention. And I see Kinsey coming on now too.
Hi there, it's Kinsey speaking. We do have a couple of questions that came in through the chat. We might have time to answer one or two. I think, let's see, Alex asks, I'll paste this in the chat as well. Yo-Yo mentions a beginning to this work in 2019. And Alex wondered if anyone might expand on how the pandemic may have impacted the trajectory of their work and practice, or even just their thinking surrounding disability and access.
Yeah, the pandemic is a huge part of just like making work right now. I think it's impossible to make work that isn't really speaking to that. But I'm realizing so many more people have been coming into the fold of chronic illness and disability like discourse because of COVID, where a lot of people are COVID long haulers, a lot of people are experiencing like navigating getting care for the first time, like getting therapy for the first time, figuring out how to like cope, like figuring out like what are the ways in which we can continue to sustain ourselves in a way that, yeah, like isn't coming from a place of like needing to get something fixed up, but just like a prolonged system of care. So I think what I've been witnessing has been like, yeah, like an expansion of chronically ill community, and also, yeah, like I think the practice has been very difficult for me personally right now, because I think there's a big push right now to kind of like go back to a place of like producing work at a pace that was like pre-COVID times. And I was just like in the rehearsal space yesterday, and I was just like, wow, there's like an uptick in cases in New York City, and like the mask mandates are still optional, you know, and like, you know, my friend like ran the marathon, and he like came to my studio to like work on this project with me. And I was just like, oh, like this could be potentially unsafe, and yet we're still doing this. And so I think there's a lot of risk right now that isn't being talked about. And there's a lot of like continued illness that isn't really being talked about in a broader sense. And so right now, at least, I've been finding it quite, yeah, just like intense to be making stuff. And yeah, like also thinking about how, you know, I started making this work pre-pandemic about my chronic illness, and then how then the pandemic hit, and then like illness became like a very top of mind thing for everyone. But I think it's interesting how the discourse around how illness is something that is possible for everyone is also something that people are like, yeah, like wanting to eradicate, wanting to remove, wanting to just like cure. And I think a lot of that is like within the US culture of, you know, medicalization, the pharmaceutical industry, all of that, that I think, yeah, like the pressure to like remove the illness and like go back to working has been very difficult to manage. And so many of my practices kind of moved into Zoom, like the movement practice that I mentioned with different artists is all held on Zoom. But, you know, we didn't do that in a way that was like, oh man, we have to use Zoom. I think we did it in a way because it was like, this is the way to connect with each other in this time. And, you know, we've been doing video calls even pre-pandemic, and we want to be together. And this is the most accessible way to do it at this moment. So I think even just like building a close and desirable relationship to communing digitally has been a big part of the practice. Yeah.
We're like at time. Maybe Shannon, like instead of responding to a question, like I don't know if you want to do that, or if something's on your heart that you just want to share, like before we exit.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to wrap up, and just I think want to express my gratitude to the two of you for chatting today, and for all the folks that have made this happen. And this for me is like my favorite thing is to be able to like think through these things together and talk about how other people are experiencing them. So I'm just really, really appreciative of that.
Yeah, same. Yeah. And like I really want to find more ways of creating these connections again and having these conversations again and having them 1,000 more times, you know? Because yeah, this is like how we create the movements that that Dustin is like talking about. And I don't know. Yeah, I'm just like, this is also bringing a lot to the table for me. So thank you.
Cool. And deep appreciation for both of y'all too.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all so much, Shannon, Dustin, and Yo-Yo, for, yes, creating this space for us, sharing your experiences and your thoughts and just talking through things together. I think we just so much appreciate having your voices in the space and being able to take this time with you. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this conversation. And yes, and please like keep these conversations going with yourself, internally, with others. And we will certainly at the Roundtable plan to continue this conversation as well, because it's vital to continue. So thank you for noting that, Yo-Yo. And I just want to, I'm going to launch a quick poll while we're closing out here. If you have 2 minutes to stay and answer it, we would very much appreciate it. Your feedback is so important to us. And we do read it all and check it all out. So while you're filling that out, I just want to invite everyone to our conference closing event, which is today at 4 p.m. It's 1 hour from 4 to 5. That is titled Youth Have the Floor, in conversation with choreographer Ayodele Cassell. You should have access to that in the exact same email that you used to access this session. So please join us today from 4 to 5 for that. Last piece of this conference, and I also just want to plug one more time, 1 week from today, we will be hosting an in-person 2022 Arts and Education Job Fair at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. They are partners with the Roundtable in creating that event, as well as Community Word Project. So there is a link in the chat there. That's May 5th from 4 to 7. You have a link where you can learn more about the job fair, who's going to be there, and you can register for a time slot as well. So please join us there and later today. And thank you once more to Shannon, Dustin, and Yo-Yo. So much appreciate spending this time with you. I'm going to end this poll. Thanks for your feedback, everyone. And I'll end this meeting. Have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.